He threw her out, shouting, "Go have the baby alone." But a year and a half later, when he saw her, with 3 identical babies, he froze. Rain fell in slow, heavy sheets that morning, the kind that made the city seem quieter, as if the world itself wanted to disappear for a while. Emma stood at the top of the marble steps, her fingers clutching the handle of a small suitcase. Everything she owned fit inside it now, 2 years of her life reduced to a few folded clothes, a framed photo, and a single test she hadn't meant for him to see. The front door of the mansion loomed open behind her, the echo of raised voices still ringing in her ears. In front of her stood Adam Blake, the man she had once thought would never hurt her, the man who had promised her the world. His brown eyes, once warm and full of laughter, were hard now, like the surface of polished wood. He looked at her as if she were a stranger who had trespassed into his life. "I can't do this," he said, his voice low but trembling with fury. "I built everything I have with discipline and control, and you—" He stopped himself, glancing at the test in her hand, the small plastic strip that carried the truth she had been both terrified and desperate to share. His jaw tightened. "You think I'm ready to throw it all away for a mistake?" Emma's heart twisted. "A mistake?" she repeated, her voice breaking. "This is your child, Adam. Our child." "You said—" "I said a lot of things," he cut her off sharply. His hand came down on the railing beside him, the sound echoing through the hall. "But I didn't mean for this. You want to ruin everything I've worked for? You want to trap me with a baby?" The tears came before she could stop them. "I'm not trapping you," she whispered. "I thought you'd be happy. I thought—" "Then you thought wrong," he said coldly. He stepped forward and ripped the test from her hand, staring at it with disgust, as if it were proof of a betrayal instead of life itself. "Go have the baby on your own. I'm done." The words cut through her like glass. She stared at him, the air leaving her lungs. "You don't mean that." He didn't answer. Instead, he turned, grabbed her suitcase from the floor, and threw it out the door, the contents spilling into the rain. The sound of the latch closing behind him was the end of everything. For a moment, she couldn't move. Her body felt numb, her mind blank. Only when thunder cracked above the house did she step forward, down the steps, into the storm. The rain soaked her hair and her clothes, but she didn't care. She gathered her things slowly, the water turning the photograph in her bag into a blur of faces. Her heart pounded against her ribs, her breath coming in sharp bursts. Somewhere deep inside her, beneath the pain, something new began to form, a resolve she didn't yet understand. She didn't look back at the house again. There was nothing left for her there. She walked through the iron gates barefoot, the gravel biting at her feet, and didn't stop until she reached the bus stop at the edge of the city. Her hands shook as she held the ticket the driver gave her, her reflection flickering in the rain-streaked glass. She didn't know where she was going, only that it had to be far away. The ride was long and silent, the bus nearly empty. She stared out the window, watching the city fade into gray countryside. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, the coldness, the finality in his voice. She pressed a hand to her stomach, her tears returning silently. "I'll keep you safe," she whispered. "I don't know how, but I will." When the bus stopped hours later in a small coastal town, she stepped off into the scent of salt and wet earth. The streets were quiet, lined with small shops and cottages painted in soft colors that had faded from the sun. It wasn't home, but it was somewhere new. Somewhere he wouldn't find her. She found a small room to rent above a florist's shop, the wallpaper peeling and the heater barely working. It didn't matter. It was hers. The old woman who owned the shop gave her work hemming dresses and fixing old coats, and though the pay was small, Emma worked from dawn until her fingers ached. Every night, she fell asleep to the sound of the sea outside the window, her hand resting on her stomach, feeling the faint flutter of life inside. It scared her sometimes, the thought of doing it all alone, but it also gave her strength. The days passed slowly, each one harder than the last, but she learned to live again in small ways. She smiled at the old woman who brought her tea in the mornings, at the children who ran down the street with kites when the wind was strong. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between stitches, she would imagine what her child would look like. Would they have her blue eyes, or his deep brown ones? She tried not to think about him, but every night, when the lights went out, his voice came back to her, sharp and final. And then one evening, as she folded fabric under the soft glow of the lamp, she felt a sudden, sharp movement inside her belly, 3 little kicks, so close together it made her gasp. She pressed her hand there, tears rising again, but this time they were different. 3, she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief and wonder. Oh my God! The doctor confirmed it days later, triplets. 3 little lives. 3 chances to love, to heal, to start again. That night, she sat on her narrow bed, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the storm raging outside the window. Lightning flashed over the sea, the same kind of storm that had driven her away from him months ago. But now, as thunder rolled through the night, she felt no fear. Her world had been broken apart, but in its ruins something stronger was taking root. She had lost everything, but she wasn't empty. She placed her hand over her heart, then over her stomach, where 3 tiny heartbeats pulsed with life. We'll be okay, she whispered into the dark. I promise you that. And for the first time since that terrible morning, she meant it. The months that followed passed in a blur of exhaustion, small victories, and the kind of loneliness that left her gasping in the quiet hours of the night. Emma's belly grew, round and heavy, her back aching from the weight of the 3 lives inside her. Every morning she woke before sunrise to work at her sewing table, the hum of the old machine her only companion. The sound had become like a lullaby for her fears. She worked through the pain, through the fatigue, through the ache of memories she couldn't silence. The room above the florist's shop was small and drafty, but it smelled faintly of roses, and sometimes, when the sea breeze came through the window, she could almost believe she was safe. The town had started to accept her quietly. The florist, Mrs. Larkin, always left extra bread or milk by her door with a small note that said, "For you and the little ones." Emma never asked how the woman knew. Kindness in small towns had its own way of finding those who needed it. A few customers had become regulars, women who loved the way Emma's hands could turn old clothes into something new. They didn't know her story, but sometimes they caught a certain sadness in her eyes and smiled at her a little softer because of it. She appreciated that. She didn't want their questions. She just wanted to survive. At night, she would lie in bed, her hands resting on her stomach, feeling the babies move. The tiny kicks came more often now, sometimes strong enough to make her gasp. She would whisper to them in the dark, her voice full of love and fear all at once. "You're safe," she would say. "You're my little miracles. I don't know how we'll make it, but we will." It wasn't just a promise anymore, it was her only truth. When the time came, it happened faster than she expected. The labor started during a storm, the kind that rolled in from the sea and rattled the windows. She was alone in the room when the first pain hit, sharp and deep, stealing her breath. Panic flooded her as another contraction came, stronger this time. She barely made it down the stairs before Mrs. Larkin saw her and called for help. Everything after that blurred into flashes, the sound of rain pounding against the roof, the rough feel of hands helping her into a car, the echo of her own screams filling the small local hospital. She didn't remember much, only the moment she heard the first cry, thin and fierce, followed by another and then another. 3 tiny voices breaking through the storm. When she woke hours later, the sky had cleared. Morning sunlight spilled across the white hospital sheets, and beside her lay 3 small bundles wrapped in soft blankets. Her heart clenched at the sight. They were perfect, each with a head of dark brown hair and eyes that mirrored his. But when one of them blinked and looked at her, she saw something else too, herself. The strength she didn't know she had. The love that had refused to die. She reached out with trembling hands, touching their tiny fingers, their warm skin, their beating hearts. She wept silently, not out of pain, but because for the first time in months she didn't feel alone. The nurses were kind. They whispered about how strong she was, how rare it was for a woman to give birth to triplets on her own and still smile afterward. She didn't tell them that her smile came from something deeper than pride. It came from defiance, from the quiet victory of surviving everything that was meant to break her. She named them Sophia, Lily, and Clara. Names she had always loved, names that carried gentleness and grace. When she whispered them aloud for the first time, it felt like she was breathing again after drowning for too long. The weeks that followed were the hardest of her life. 3 newborns meant sleepless nights and endless worry. She learned to live in small moments, the smell of milk, the sound of their breathing, the warmth of their skin against hers. She barely ate, barely rested, but every morning when she looked at their faces, she found the strength to keep going. The florist helped when she could, bringing food and watching the babies while Emma worked. The town rallied quietly around her, each person doing something small, a blanket, a bag of diapers, a ride to the clinic. They didn't pity her, they respected her. She became known as the young woman who smiled through storms. Still, there were nights when she sat by the window, holding one of the babies close, staring out at the sea and wondering if he ever thought of her. She told herself she didn't care. She told herself she hated him. But sometimes, when exhaustion took over and her heart softened with longing, she would whisper to the darkness, "If you could see them, you'd love them. You'd have to." Then she would press her lips to her daughters' heads and force the thought away. Time passed, and the babies grew stronger. At 5 months, they were all smiles and laughter, their tiny hands reaching for her face whenever she leaned over their crib. Their laughter filled the little apartment like sunlight. The weight of what she had lost still lived inside her, but it no longer defined her. Each giggle, each new sound, each tiny heartbeat reminded her that she had built something real out of the ashes of her old life. Sometimes, when she took them for walks along the shore, she would stop and watch the waves, the horizon stretching endlessly ahead. The air smelled of salt and new beginnings. She would hold her daughters close, their small bodies pressed against her chest, and whisper, "We're going to be okay. I promise." The wind would carry her words away, but she knew the ocean heard her. And though she didn't know it yet, far away, in a high-rise office where rain still fell against glass windows, Adam Blake sometimes caught himself staring at the same kind of storm, unable to explain why his chest ached, or why he couldn't shake the image of a woman's voice saying his name through the sound of rain. 5 months after the birth of the girls, Emma had learned how to live in quiet rhythm with her new reality. Her days began before dawn, when the first light crept across the window and one of the babies inevitably began to stir. She had learned to tell them apart by the smallest details. Sophia had a dimple that appeared whenever she smiled in her sleep, Lily's cries were softer, as if she were always apologizing for needing attention, and Clara had a determined little brow, already frowning at the world as though she were born ready to take it on. Emma loved every detail, every tiny imperfection, every sound. They had become her reason to breathe, her reason to push through exhaustion, and her reason to keep forgiving life for all it had taken from her. Still, There were nights when she lay awake long after they'd fallen asleep, her body aching from the endless cycle of feeding, rocking, and comforting. The silence after their cries stopped was both a blessing and a curse. It was in that silence that her mind wandered, back to the life she had lost, to the man who had chosen pride over love. She told herself that she didn't miss him, that she only missed the idea of what he could have been. But sometimes she remembered the sound of his laugh, the warmth of his hands, the way he had once looked at her like she was the only thing that made sense in his chaotic world. Then she would feel something she hated herself for feeling, regret mixed with longing, the kind that tightened her throat until she could barely breathe. Adam Blake's life, meanwhile, had become a study in perfection that looked flawless from the outside but rotted slowly from within. The business empire he had built was larger than ever, his face appeared in magazines, and his name carried the kind of power that used to make him proud. Yet he woke up every morning with the same hollow ache that no success could quiet. His penthouse apartment was filled with everything he could buy, modern art, Italian suits, expensive silence, but none of it meant anything anymore. He had begun to avoid mirrors, not because he disliked what he saw, but because he no longer recognized the man staring back. He was restless, angry for reasons he couldn't name, short-tempered with his employees, and increasingly withdrawn. He spent long nights in his office, staring at the city lights, haunted by something he couldn't name, something that lingered in the corners of his mind like a shadow. Sometimes he would dream of rain. In those dreams, there was always a woman standing at the edge of a storm, her face turned away, her hair wet and shining under the gray sky. He would wake up drenched in sweat, his heart racing, and the emptiness beside him in bed would feel like a wound. He told himself it was guilt, nothing more. He had done what he thought was right. He had avoided ruin. But as the days went on, that lie began to crumble. One afternoon, his new assistant, a young woman with sharp eyes and a nervous energy, mentioned something casually during a meeting. "Sir, I met someone in Sidmont Bay who said they used to work with Emma Lawrence," she said, scrolling through her notes. "You knew her, didn't you?" The sound of her name was like a blow to the chest. He froze, his pen slipping from his hand. "Emma," he repeated, his voice quieter than he intended. The assistant nodded, oblivious to his reaction. "Yes, I think she's still there. She's got some small sewing business now, or something like that." He said nothing for the rest of the meeting. But after she left, he sat alone for a long time, staring at the rain streaking down the window. Sidmont Bay. A name he had never heard before, and yet it pulled at something deep inside him. He didn't know why he cared. He told himself it was curiosity, maybe guilt, maybe a need for closure. But the truth was more complicated. The truth was that part of him had never stopped wondering. That night, he opened the drawer of his desk and took out the one photograph he had never thrown away. It was of Emma, standing in the garden of his house, sunlight tangled in her hair, her smile soft and unguarded. He remembered the way she had looked at him that day, as if she believed he could be something better than he was. His hand trembled slightly as he traced her face with his thumb. The memory of her voice came back to him then, clear and vivid. "You don't always have to fight the world, Adam. Sometimes, it's okay to let it love you." He had laughed at her then, dismissing her words as naive. Now, years later, they felt like a prophecy he had ignored. The next morning, he told his assistant to clear his schedule. "I'm taking a few days off," he said curtly. "Personal matters." It wasn't something he ever said. The entire office fell silent when the words left his mouth. He didn't explain further. Within hours, he was on a plane, the city shrinking beneath him, the clouds swallowing the horizon. The drive from the airport to Sidmont Bay was long and quiet. The road wound along the coast, the sea flashing silver in the distance. When he reached the town, he was struck by its simplicity. It was small, peaceful, untouched by the noise of the world he came from. He parked near a cafe and stepped out, the smell of salt and coffee mixing in the air. For a long moment, he just stood there, unsure what he was even looking for. He had no plan, no destination. Only a name and a memory. He walked through the narrow streets, past shops with hand-painted signs and children chasing each other through puddles. It felt unreal, as if he had stepped into a life that didn't belong to him. And then, from across the street, he heard laughter, soft, high-pitched, the unmistakable sound of a child. He turned instinctively. There, on a bench outside a small cafe, sat Emma. Her hair was lighter now, touched with sunlight, and her face was thinner, paler, but there was no mistaking her. She was holding a baby in her arms, her movements gentle and instinctive, her eyes full of a love he had never understood before. Beside her, in a double stroller, 2 more babies sat, identical, their tiny hands reaching for her. They all had the same dark brown hair and wide, curious eyes. His eyes. For a moment, the world stopped. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He could only stare at the impossible truth in front of him. 3 babies. His daughters. His heart hammered against his ribs, a rush of guilt and disbelief and something deeper, something like awe, crashing through him. Emma looked up then, her gaze meeting his. For a second, neither of them moved. The years between them vanished in an instant, replaced by something raw and electric. Her lips parted slightly, her face going pale. Then she stood up abruptly, clutching the baby to her chest, her expression turning from shock to fury. He took a hesitant step forward. "Emma," he began, his voice rough and broken. "Don't," she said sharply, her voice trembling but firm. "Don't come near me." The sound of her voice cut through him, sharper than any accusation. He froze, watching as she turned and hurried down the street, the stroller wheels rattling against the cobblestones, the rain beginning to fall again. He stood there until she disappeared from view, the storm rising around him, realizing in that single, devastating moment that he had not just lost her once, he had lost the only part of himself that had ever truly mattered. The rain had started to fall harder, soaking through Adam's jacket as he stood frozen on the cobblestone street. His shoes splashed in shallow puddles, but he didn't move, couldn't move, as the image of Emma disappearing around the corner burned into his mind. His breath came shallow, and his heart pounded like it was trying to break free from his chest. For years, he had told himself that what he'd done was justified, that he had made the rational choice, the right choice for his career and his future. But now, standing in that quiet seaside town with the sound of rain and distant laughter echoing in the air, he realized that all his logic had been nothing more than cowardice dressed as reason. The sight of those 3 tiny girls, his daughters, had shattered every wall he had built around himself. They were proof of everything he had thrown away. He found himself walking aimlessly through the streets, following where he thought Emma might have gone. The town was small, the kind of place where everyone seemed to know each other, yet every door felt closed to him. He asked a few shopkeepers, describing her with a voice that shook, but they looked at him cautiously, unwilling to speak. It was clear she belonged to this place now. She had built something for herself here, and he was an intruder. Still, he couldn't stop searching. The rain soaked through his hair, and his hands trembled as he pushed them into his pockets, trying to keep control of the storm raging inside him. He didn't know what he wanted to say to her if he found her, only that he had to. Meanwhile, Emma had fled to her small apartment above the florist's shop, her heart racing so fast she thought she might faint. She locked the door behind her and leaned against it, clutching Sophia tightly against her chest while Lily and Clara whimpered softly in their stroller. Her hands were shaking, her mind spinning with disbelief. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, what she would do if she ever saw him again, but in every version of it, she had been stronger, colder, untouched by him. Yet when she had met his eyes, all the pain she thought she'd buried came rushing back like a wave. She had seen shock on his face, and something else too, something raw and human that made her want to scream. She laid the babies down in their crib, her movements careful and automatic. They were restless, sensing her unease, and she hummed softly to calm them, though her own voice trembled. Once they drifted off, she sank into the chair by the window, her hands covering her face. She could still see him standing there, drenched in rain, his expression torn between guilt and wonder. For a brief, dangerous moment, her heart had ached for him, as though the years hadn't passed at all. But then she remembered the sound of his voice that night, cold and merciless, the words that had destroyed her. "Go have the baby on your own." No, she thought bitterly. He didn't get to come back now. He didn't get to see them, not after everything. She had built this life alone. She had earned every sleepless night, every meal skipped so her daughters could eat. He had no right to any of it. But the memory of his face wouldn't leave her. There had been something in his eyes, a fracture, a wound he hadn't been able to hide. And that scared her more than the anger did. Because if he still had the power to look at her like that, if she still felt the pull of that old connection, then maybe she wasn't as free from him as she'd told herself. The next morning, Adam sat in his car near the harbor, watching the gray sea churn under the cloudy sky. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her. He saw the babies. He thought of the life she had built without him, and for the first time in his life, he felt something close to shame. Not the kind that came from public failure or damaged reputation, but the kind that came from realizing how completely he had destroyed something good. He remembered that day, the anger, the fear, the pride that had made him say those unforgivable words. He had been terrified. Terrified of losing control, of becoming his father, of watching everything he had built crumble because of love. And so he had chosen to kill it before it could destroy him. But now, looking at the rain falling on the water, he realized that in trying to protect his life, he had ruined it anyway. He didn't leave the town that day. He couldn't. He spent hours walking the streets, hoping to see her again. He passed by the florist's shop, recognizing the faint scent of roses from the bouquet she used to keep in his office. He wondered if she had chosen this place because it was the opposite of the world he lived in, quiet, kind, forgiving. He wanted to knock on the door, to beg her to let him explain, but he couldn't. What could he possibly say that would undo the past? That evening, as the sun sank behind the ocean, he saw her again. She was walking along the harbor with a stroller, the babies bundled against the chill, their tiny faces peeking from beneath soft hats. She hadn't seen him yet. He stood in the shadows, his heart thundering. He watched as she stopped by the railing, her hair catching the last golden light of the day. One of the babies began to fuss, and he watched her smile gently, humming under her breath as she rocked the stroller. It was such a simple, beautiful sight that it broke something inside him. This was the life he could have had, the laughter, the warmth, the small miracles, and he had thrown it away for ambition and fear. Without realizing it, he took a step forward, then another. She turned, startled, her eyes locking with his. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The sea wind whipped between them, carrying the scent of salt and something electric in the air. Finally, she said, "Why are you here, Adam?" Her voice was steady, but her hands were tight on the stroller's handle. He swallowed hard, his voice barely audible. "I had to see you." Her expression hardened. You saw enough when you threw me out. I was wrong, he said quickly, his words spilling out before he could stop them. Emma, God, I was so wrong. I was scared, and I didn't know how to handle it. I thought I was doing what was right, but I see now that I— Stop, she said sharply, her voice cracking. You don't get to do this. You don't get to show up and say you're sorry like it fixes anything. Her eyes glistened, but she refused to cry. You don't know what it was like, Adam. You don't know what it cost me to survive without you. To raise them alone. He took a hesitant step closer. Let me make it right. Please. I just want a chance to— To what? She interrupted, her voice trembling now. To play the hero? To walk back into our lives after destroying them? She shook her head, her lips pressed tight. No. I won't let you hurt them the way you hurt me. He stood there, the weight of her words pressing down on him like stone. The babies began to fuss again, breaking the silence. Emma turned away, rocking them gently, her face half lit by the fading sun. I'm not going anywhere, he said quietly, his voice low but firm. I'll wait as long as it takes. She didn't look at him again, but her jaw tightened, and her eyes shimmered with something he couldn't quite name, anger, pain, or maybe, deep down, a trace of the love that refused to die. As he watched her walk away again, pushing the stroller down the pier, he knew one thing for certain. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing power or control or money. He was chasing redemption, and he didn't know if he would ever catch it. But he would never stop trying. Adam didn't leave Sidmont Bay. Each day bled quietly into the next, marked by the soft rhythm of rain and the distant sound of the ocean. He rented a small apartment near the harbor, nothing like the glass penthouse he had left behind, but it suited him. It was strange to live without the hum of meetings and the constant vibration of his phone, to wake up to silence instead of a calendar filled with obligations. He spent most of his morning sitting on the balcony overlooking the water, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands as he watched the fishermen untie their boats. For the first time in years, he had no control over what came next. It terrified him, but it also felt like something close to peace. He didn't approach Emma again right away. He knew she wouldn't want to see him, and he didn't blame her. So he waited. He saw her sometimes from a distance, the way she pushed the stroller through the market, her hair catching the morning light, her laughter soft and real as one of the babies reached out to grab her necklace. He saw the way she smiled at the florist who always handed her fresh daisies, and how the townspeople greeted her with a warmth that came only from respect. She had built something for herself here, something pure and steady. Every time he saw her, a part of him ached, not only for what he'd lost, but for what she had become without him. He wanted to help her, but he didn't know how. The few people he had spoken to in town treated him with polite suspicion, as if they could sense the ghosts that followed him. He wasn't used to being invisible. For years, he had been the man who commanded rooms, who spoke and watched people scramble to listen. But here, he was just another stranger who didn't belong. It humbled him in a way he hadn't expected. He started to understand, slowly, that power and money had never been strength at all, they had been armor, and he had worn it so long he'd forgotten what it meant to be human underneath. One afternoon, while he was sitting in the cafe near the harbor, he heard a soft voice behind him. "You've been here for weeks," Emma said. He turned, his heart stuttering at the sight of her. She was standing there, arms crossed, her hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders, her blue eyes colder than he remembered. She wasn't the same woman he had known. She looked stronger now, her posture steady, her expression composed. But beneath it, he could still see the hurt he had caused. "I didn't want to leave," he said quietly. Not until I made things right. She let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. There's no right anymore, Adam. That's gone. You don't get to fix what you destroyed just because you feel guilty now. He swallowed hard. You're right. I can't fix it. But maybe I can still do something. Anything. Let me help. Help, she repeated bitterly. You think you can just walk in and make yourself useful? I don't need your money. I don't need anything from you. I know you don't, he said quickly. But they might. Her eyes flashed with anger. Don't you dare talk about them. You don't even know their names. He lowered his gaze, shame flooding him. Then tell me, he said softly. Tell me, Emma. Please. The silence between them stretched, heavy and tense. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, torn between fury and exhaustion. Finally, she sighed. Sophia, Lily, and Clara, she said, her voice low. The way she said the names broke him. He repeated them quietly, tasting them like a prayer. They're beautiful, he said after a long pause. They're everything, she replied. Her voice softened for the briefest moment before hardening again. And they don't need you. She turned to leave, but he rose from his chair. Emma, wait, he said, taking a step toward her. You don't have to forgive me. I don't expect that. But please don't shut me out of their lives completely. I've made mistakes, I know that better than anyone, but I can't walk away again. I won't. Her jaw tightened, her shoulders stiff. You think showing up now makes you a father? No, he said. But maybe it means I can try to be one. Her expression faltered for a moment, her lips parting slightly as if his words had hit something she didn't want to feel. You don't understand what it's been like, she whispered. You have no idea what I've had to do to keep them safe, to give them a life. And now you show up and think you can just fit in? Like the past didn't happen? I know the past happened, he said. I live with it every day. I see it every time I close my eyes. For a long moment, neither spoke. The cafe buzzed quietly around them, the scent of coffee and rain lingering in the air. Finally, she turned away. I have to go, she said. He nodded, his throat tight. I'll be here, he murmured. Even if you never want to see me again, I'll be here. She didn't look back as she left. After that day, he kept his distance, but he didn't leave. Sometimes, when she took the girls for walks near the harbor, she saw him sitting on a bench, watching the water. He never approached, never spoke, but she knew he was there. It unnerved her at first, then confused her, and eventually, against her will, it started to comfort her. He wasn't demanding, wasn't trying to force his way back. He was just present. Quietly, patiently, like someone waiting for a tide to change. Weeks passed like that. The townspeople began to talk less, to stop noticing him altogether. He started helping at the docks, hauling nets and crates, his hands roughening from the work. He wasn't the man in the tailored suit anymore. He looked ordinary, almost humble. One morning, Mrs. Larkin, the florist, saw him carrying boxes and smiled knowingly. People do strange things for love, she said softly. When Emma heard about it, she didn't know how to feel. Part of her wanted to believe it was a performance, another calculated gesture from the man who once saw her as an inconvenience. But another part of her, quieter, more dangerous, wondered if it was something else. The girls had begun to recognize him too. Once, when she walked past him in the square, Sophia pointed and giggled, her little voice calling, "Man." Adam had smiled, his eyes bright and wet, and Emma had to turn away quickly before her composure cracked. Late one evening, after the babies had fallen asleep, Emma sat by the window, looking out at the harbor lights. She could see his silhouette sitting on the pier, motionless against the dark water. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel anger. She just felt tired. Maybe he really had changed. Maybe not. But as she watched the waves crash against the shore, something inside her whispered that it wasn't over yet, not for either of them. The storm that rolled in that week seemed to carry the tension that had been building between them. The wind howled through Sidmont Bay, and rain drummed against the rooftops for days, turning the cobblestone streets slick and shining. Emma stayed mostly inside, keeping the babies warm and entertained, their laughter echoing softly through the small apartment. She tried to focus on the rhythm of her life, the feedings, the laundry, the endless cycle of care, but her thoughts kept slipping toward him. She hadn't seen Adam in several days, though she knew he was still there. Somehow, she could feel his presence in the town, the same way she could feel a storm before it broke. She told herself it didn't matter, that his absence didn't bother her, but she caught herself glancing toward the harbor more often than she wanted to admit. Part of her wondered if he had finally given up, if he had realized that her forgiveness was something he could never earn. But then another part of her, one she didn't want to listen to, whispered that maybe she didn't want him to leave after all. The thought terrified her. She had spent years building walls around herself and her daughters. To let him in now would mean tearing all of them down, and she didn't know if she could survive that again. On the third night of the storm, there was a knock at her door. She hesitated, her heart pounding, before opening it. Adam stood there, drenched, the rain dripping from his hair and shoulders. His clothes were soaked, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, those deep, steady brown eyes, held something she hadn't seen before. Not arrogance, not pride, not even apology. Just quiet desperation. "Emma," he said, his voice rough. "I'm sorry to come like this. The power went out near the docks. I was helping secure some of the boats and..." He trailed off, realizing how ridiculous it sounded. "I didn't know where else to go." She stared at him for a long moment before stepping aside wordlessly, motioning him in. He hesitated, then entered, his boots leaving wet marks on the floor. The small apartment felt even smaller with him there. The girls were asleep in their crib, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Adam stopped when he saw them, his entire body going still. For a moment, it was as if the world had stopped breathing. He took a slow step forward, then another, his eyes softening as he looked down at them. "They're beautiful," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. Emma folded her arms, watching him carefully. "You said that before," she said quietly. He looked up at her, guilt flickering across his face. "I meant it then, but I didn't. I didn't understand it until now." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the steady rhythm of rain on the window and the low creak of the old floorboards. Adam stood beside the crib, his eyes tracing every small detail of the girls' faces, their identical lashes, their tiny curled fingers, the faint smile that flickered in Clara's sleep. He looked like a man trying to memorize something sacred. "They have your eyes," he said finally. "No," she said softly, her voice steady but sad. "They have yours." He turned toward her then, and in that moment, the distance between them felt unbearable. He wanted to say something, anything, but every word he thought of felt too small for what he was feeling. "Emma," he started, his voice breaking. "I can't change what I did. I was a coward. I thought I was protecting myself, protecting my life, but all I did was destroy everything that mattered. I've lived every day since that night trying to convince myself it was for the best, but it wasn't. It was the worst decision I ever made. Her eyes glistened in the dim light. You think saying that makes it better? No, he said quickly. I don't expect forgiveness. I need you to know that I see it now. All of it. The pain, the strength it took for you to do this alone. You were right to walk away from me. But I can't keep pretending that I don't care. I can't live with the thought that I'll never know them. She turned away, walking toward the window. The storm outside reflected the chaos inside her. You don't understand what you're asking. They're my whole world. I've built their lives on peace, on stability. Letting you in would destroy that. He moved closer, stopping a few feet behind her. I don't want to destroy anything. I just want to be part of it, even if it's small. I'll take whatever you'll give me. I'll stand outside and watch from a distance if that's all I can do. But please, Emma, don't shut me out completely. His words cracked something open inside her, and she hated that they did. She had told herself for so long that he didn't deserve even a thought, much less a place in their lives. But as she looked at him now, soaked and trembling, with the weight of regret written in every line of his face, she saw not the man who had abandoned her, but the man who could finally see what he had lost. She let out a shaky breath, pressing her palm against the windowpane. You can't just decide to be part of their lives now, she said softly. It's not that simple. I know, he said. But let me try. Let me prove it's not too late. She turned then, her blue eyes meeting his. There was a long silence between them, filled with the sound of rain and the soft breaths of their sleeping daughters. Finally, she nodded once. You can come by tomorrow, she said. If you really mean what you're saying, start by showing up. He blinked, almost as if he didn't believe her. Tomorrow? Yes, she said, her voice steadier now. But this isn't forgiveness. This is a beginning. Maybe. He nodded slowly, his throat tight. I'll be here. When he left, she stood by the door long after it closed, her hands trembling. She wanted to feel anger, but all she felt was exhaustion and something far more dangerous, hope. She told herself it didn't mean anything, that she was only doing what was right for the girls. But when she finally turned off the lights and looked at them sleeping, she whispered, maybe it's time you meet your father. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sun broke through the clouds, glinting on puddles and rooftops. Adam arrived early, his eyes cautious but bright with determination. He brought no gifts, no flowers, no grand gestures, only himself. And for the first time, that was enough. As he stepped inside, Emma watched him kneel beside the crib, his large hands trembling as he touched Sophia's tiny hand. The baby's fingers curled instinctively around his, and something inside him broke completely. He didn't speak, he didn't have to. In that quiet, golden morning light, Emma saw something in his face she had never seen before. Not charm, not power, not control, just pure, unguarded love. And though she didn't know what would happen next, she felt the first fragile thread of something she had thought was gone forever begin to weave itself back into her heart. The days that followed felt like walking across a bridge made of glass, each step fragile, careful, uncertain. Adam began visiting quietly every morning. At first, Emma kept her distance, sitting across the room as he awkwardly learned to hold one of the girls or bottle feed another, his large hands clumsy but gentle. He moved slowly, afraid of breaking the delicate balance of their small world. The babies were cautious too, their curious eyes studying this stranger who had suddenly appeared in their lives, though they soon warmed to him in the innocent way children do. The sound of their laughter began to fill the small apartment, light and soft, weaving through the air like a forgotten melody that had been waiting to be heard again. Emma watched it all with an ache she couldn't name. She told herself she was only allowing it for their sake, that it was good for the girls to know their father, even if he had come too late. But deep down, she knew there was more to it. Each time she saw him kneel beside the crib or heard him whisper nonsense words that made the babies giggle, the old walls around her heart began to shift. She caught herself studying his face when he thought she wasn't looking, the way his smile now came slower but softer, how his eyes lingered on the girls as though he still couldn't believe they were real. There was something new in him now, something that wasn't there before, humility. The town began to notice too. People saw him at the market carrying bags of groceries, at the florist buying flowers for Mrs. Larkin in thanks, or walking down the pier with a stroller beside him. They whispered about how strange it was to see a man like him there, the once famous CEO, now pushing a stroller with his sleeves rolled up and a tired but peaceful look on his face. Some said it wouldn't last, that men like him always left eventually. But others saw the quiet persistence in his eyes and began to believe differently. For Emma, trust was a slow and painful process. There were moments she wanted to send him away, to remind him that he didn't deserve to be here, that she hadn't forgotten the way he had thrown her out into the rain with nothing but a suitcase and her unborn children. But then there were moments, unexpected and disarming, when she would see one of the girls asleep in his arms, their tiny fingers gripping his shirt, and her anger would melt into something she didn't want to name. One evening, after the girls had fallen asleep, she found him still sitting on the couch, his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. The dim lamplight cast shadows on his face, highlighting the tired lines she hadn't noticed before. "You should go," she said softly, not unkindly. "It's late." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with something raw. "I don't want to go." She hesitated, leaning against the doorway. "Why are you really here, Adam? Is it guilt? Regret? You don't owe me anything anymore." "I'm here because I finally understand what I lost," he said quietly. "And I can't live another day pretending I don't care. I've spent years trying to fill the space you left, with money, power, anything I could control, but nothing worked. Every night I saw your face, heard your voice. And now, when I see them..." His voice cracked slightly. "When I see them, I see everything I could have had. Everything I still want, if you'll let me." She crossed her arms, fighting the trembling in her hands. "You can't just walk back into my life and say things like that. You don't get to make me believe again." "I'm not asking you to believe me," he said. "I'm asking you to let me prove it." There was something in his voice, steady, quiet, but full of conviction, that made her chest tighten. She wanted to push him away, to protect herself, but she couldn't ignore the truth in his eyes. He wasn't the same man she had known. The arrogance, the cruelty, the selfishness, they were gone. What remained was someone broken but willing to rebuild, no matter how long it took. Over the next few weeks, he began helping her more, fixing a broken drawer, repainting the peeling walls, cooking breakfast when she was too tired to move. He never asked for anything in return. He didn't push, didn't demand. He just showed up, every single day, and stayed. And little by little, the air between them began to soften. One night, after a particularly long day, the girls refused to sleep. Clara was crying uncontrollably, and Emma was near tears herself. Adam took the baby gently from her arms and began to hum softly, pacing the small room. It was a song she recognized, one she used to hum when they lived together, years ago. His voice was deep and warm, and slowly, Clara's sobs quieted until she drifted to sleep. Emma watched in silence, the memory of their past flooding back in waves she couldn't stop. When he looked up at her, there was a question in his eyes, unspoken but clear. She turned away quickly, pretending to adjust the blanket. That night, after he left, she sat by the window long after midnight, staring at the lights of the harbor. She could still hear his voice in her head, low and tender, and for the first time, she didn't push it away. Maybe people could change. Maybe pain didn't have to be permanent. The next morning, when he arrived, she didn't meet him with guarded silence as she usually did. Instead, she offered him a cup of coffee and a tired smile. He blinked, surprised, but said nothing, just nodded and sat beside her at the small table. They sat there in silence for a long while, watching the sunlight spill across the floor. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something close. In the days that followed, Emma began to notice how easily he had become a part of their lives. The girls reached for him when he walked in, their laughter brighter when he was around. He took them for walks along the shore, teaching them to point at the gulls and name the colors of the sea. Sometimes, she would watch from the window, her heart heavy and full all at once. It frightened her how natural it felt, how right it looked. One afternoon, as they walked together along the beach, the sky glowing gold with sunset, she finally spoke the words that had been living inside her for years. "I hated you," she said quietly. He stopped, turning toward her, but she didn't look at him. "For a long time, I hated you so much it scared me. I thought if I ever saw you again, I'd want to hurt you the way you hurt me. But now..." She trailed off, staring at the waves. "Now I just feel tired." He stepped closer, his voice low. "You have every right to hate me." She nodded slowly. "Maybe. But I don't anymore." She finally met his gaze, and for the first time in years, her eyes weren't hard. They were sad, but also open. "I don't know what that means yet. But I think I'm ready to find out." For a long time, neither of them moved. The sound of the ocean filled the space between them, calm and endless. Then, without thinking, he reached for her hand. She hesitated, her breath catching, but she didn't pull away. The warmth of his fingers against hers felt like something fragile and unfamiliar, something that might break if she looked at it too closely. But for now, it was enough. They stood there as the sun dipped below the horizon, their hands intertwined, the world around them quiet except for the waves. For the first time in 5 years, Emma allowed herself to believe, not in the man he once was, but in the one who stood beside her now, patient, changed, and still waiting for her heart to open. Spring came slowly to Sidmount Bay, soft and golden, washing the town in light that seemed to carry forgiveness. The harsh winds of winter faded into quiet mornings filled with birdsong, and the sea turned a calm shade of blue that mirrored the sky. Emma had always loved this time of year, when the world seemed to breathe again, but this spring felt different. The air carried something new, something lighter, warmer, like the first sign of peace after a long war. It had been months since Adam had first knocked on her door that stormy night, and in that time, their lives had quietly intertwined in ways neither of them had expected. He had become part of their days, not as a guest or an outsider but as someone who belonged. The girls adored him completely. They followed him around with bright eyes and tiny footsteps, their laughter filling every corner of the apartment. Sophia loved sitting on his shoulders during walks, Lily refused to nap unless he hummed to her, and Clara had claimed his watch as her favorite toy, pressing its cold metal face to her cheek and giggling every time it ticked. Watching them together filled Emma with emotions too tangled to name. She had stopped asking herself when she would send him away. Somewhere between the mornings he made pancakes and the nights he helped fix leaky faucets, between the shared silences and the unspoken apologies, her anger had softened. The sharp edges of her pain had dulled into something bittersweet. She still remembered what he had done, she always would, but when she looked at him now, she saw not the man who had thrown her out but the man who had come back and refused to leave again. The difference was everything. One afternoon, when the girls were taking their nap, Adam sat at the small kitchen table, a notebook open in front of him. He looked up when Emma entered, her hair loosely tied back, sunlight tracing the line of her face. "What's that?" she asked, drying her hands on a towel. He hesitated before answering. "Plans," he said quietly. "For a new project. Something small." She raised an eyebrow. "Another company?" He shook his head with a faint smile. "No. Not like before. I sold most of the business last month. I'm keeping a few shares, but I'm done chasing numbers. I want to build something real this time." She frowned, curious. "Real?" He nodded. "A children's center. Here, in Sidmont Bay. For single parents, families that need help. A place where no one has to feel like they're doing it alone." Her breath caught. She hadn't expected that. "Adam." She began, her voice softening. "That's good. That's really good." He smiled faintly, closing the notebook. "It's because of you. And them." His gaze shifted toward the door of the nursery, where the quiet sound of the babies sleeping could be heard. "You showed me what strength actually looks like. I want to give that back to someone else." For a long time, she didn't speak. The silence between them was warm this time, not heavy. She walked closer, sitting across from him. "You've changed," she said finally. He met her eyes and nodded. "You changed me." She looked down, her fingers tracing the grain of the wooden table. "I didn't mean to." "I know," he said softly. "That's why it worked." Outside, the sunlight danced through the window, catching in her hair. There was something so fragile about the moment that neither dared to move. She realized then that she wasn't afraid of him anymore. The anger, the fear, the grief, they had all burned away, leaving only the quiet truth that she still loved him, though in a different way now. It wasn't the naive love of their past, it was something deeper, born of pain and forgiveness and years of learning how to survive without him. It was the kind of love that grew roots instead of wings. A few days later, they took the girls out to the harbor. The air was crisp and filled with the smell of salt. The water shimmered beneath the afternoon sun, and gulls circled lazily overhead. Adam carried Lily while Emma pushed the stroller with the other two. They stopped by the railing, the girls squealing as they leaned toward the sea, their tiny hands reaching for the waves. Adam laughed, the sound bright and full, and Emma found herself smiling without realizing it. "You know," he said after a moment, "I used to think happiness looked like power. Like being untouchable. But standing here now." He looked down at the little girls, then at her. "It's this. It's you. It always was." She turned to him, her eyes glimmering with something tender but uncertain. "Don't say things you don't mean." "I mean every word," he said simply. "You gave me a second chance at life. I'll spend the rest of it trying to be worthy of it." The wind picked up, tugging at her hair, and she closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of everything they had been through, the pain, the loss, the long road back to this fragile peace. When she opened them again, he was still looking at her, his expression open and unguarded. Slowly, she reached for his hand. Their fingers met halfway, hesitant at first, then sure. That night, after the girls were asleep, they sat together on the couch, the room lit only by the soft glow of the lamp. The world outside was quiet, the sea murmuring in the distance. Adam turned to her, his voice low. "Do you ever think about the past?" She nodded. "Every day." "And?" "I don't hate it anymore," she said. "Because it brought me here." He exhaled slowly, a quiet sound that almost broke into a laugh. "You have no idea how much I don't deserve you." She smiled faintly. "Maybe not. But that's the thing about forgiveness. You don't have to deserve it." He looked at her for a long time, his eyes shining in the dim light. Then, without words, he leaned in. She didn't pull away. The kiss was slow, hesitant, like two people learning how to breathe again. It wasn't a reunion of passion or fire, it was something gentler, deeper, the quiet acknowledgement of all the years they had lost and all the time still left to make new ones. When they finally parted, she rested her head against his shoulder, her eyes closing. "Don't leave again," she whispered. "Never," he said, and this time she believed him. Months later, the children's center opened on a bright June morning. The whole town gathered, watching as Adam cut the ribbon with shaking hands. Emma stood beside him, holding the girls, pride and love shining in her eyes. The sign above the door read the Lawrence Center, after her, his final gesture of apology and devotion. As the crowd applauded, Adam looked down at her, their daughters clapping and laughing in her arms, and he realized that redemption didn't come all at once. It came in small moments, in forgiveness offered, in trust rebuilt, in the laughter of the three little lives they had created together. That evening, as the sun set over the harbor, they stood side by side watching the waves. The past was behind them, unchangeable but no longer unbearable, and the future stretched ahead, bright and real. He slipped his arm around her shoulders, and she didn't move away. For the first time in years, the silence between them wasn't heavy, it was full. Full of peace, of love, and of the life they had both fought so hard to find again.